All right. Hello, hello, hello. It is time for the real start. Let me turn off the intro music there. Time for the actual start in the actual introduction in the actual first installment, day one of the Teach Us Dr. Hirsch series, which is going to be a lot of fun for me. So what are the goals for this class? Well, first, I'm your instructor. My name is Ricky, and I am a doctor, actually, hence the Dr. Hirsch thing. And this is going to be a new ongoing stream project for me, looking into sort of my own background as a psychology professor and trying to bring that forward, because I do strongly believe in sort of the public good of making information available. And while cleaning up my hard drive, I realized that I had all of my old Psych 101 lecture slides, so I've been tweaking those a bit, updating some of the resources, and trying to maybe actually no, I haven't updated any of the jokes. So you're getting that primo humor that it made me such a hit when I was an instructor. But anyway, so let's get into this. Let's get started. All right. So who am I? Like I said, I am a doe. I am a deer. I am a female deer. Cookie Tan did this wonderful artistic impression of me, since you're probably never going to see me from the waist down in the extent of this lecture series. Now, what am I actually, though? I am a social psychology PhD. I am a doctor of social psychology. I also have a master's degree in psychology generally, a bachelor's degree in psychology, and a bachelor's degree in sociology. So I have a lot of letters after my name, but I just never use them because that is pretentious. And by all accounts, when I was teaching this course during my PhD studies, I was actually pretty good at it. In fact, in my career since then, I've actually been a principal investigator, which we'll talk about, which means that basically I was the head of a research lab before I became a VTuber. My career trajectory has been very strange. And I've actually been the first author on multiple scientific papers, and then a lesser author on a couple. So I'm actually a published scientist, and actually, apart from being a goofy deer on the internet, I actually am a pretty serious researcher. So this is kind of a way of blending those different things in my life, and it's kind of something I'm looking forward to. And as an instructor, we did get evaluations and all that, and by most accounts, at least some of my students, I'm actually pretty good at this. And so I'm actually kind of excited to really dive into something that I do think is an area of, content, trademark symbol content that really only I can do. Maybe. I don't think there's many other people that have PhDs and end up doing this. So this is going to be a fun little project for me, and hopefully it's going to be fun for y'all, and it's actually going to be maybe something that people can use to either teach themselves or reference or do stuff like that. I'm going to editorialize a little bit as we're going on, but it'll be fun. So why am I doing this? It's a very good question. I really just do enjoy teaching, like I said. You might actually remember me or know of me from the other series I did on the book How to Do Nothing, which ended up being largely an anti-capitalist VTubing lecture series, and probably the reason I will never get into any agency. I don't think you get to put up a whole series about how content and the content industry and capitalism are bad, and then apply for bigger agencies and get in. Yeah, become Kusa, become the big Kusa. So like I said earlier, I do very strongly believe in making educational resources available for free. Actually, in the wild world of my publishing history, all of the data and papers that I have ever published are actually available on the internet for free, which is, I'm a big proponent of the open science movement and the open access movement, which we will be talking about in later chapters. But for me, I believe that there's a public good to doing research, and part of that means that you have an obligation as a researcher to do your best to make things accessible. And VTubers are popular. I happen to have this model. Why not combine them? Sounds like a good idea. So what can you expect from this course? This is going to be generally an overview. So my expectation and my hope and my dream and my plan is to, at least once a week, I'm fingers crossed once a week, maybe every other week. Sometimes these are going to take quite a while to prepare, depending on how much I have to edit stuff and how much I have to look into whether or not my references are still accurate and I'm telling you guys good information. But my hope is that when I stream, I'm going to go through probably one chapter of information, one subsection of psychology. And even though we're not really going to get into the reads on everything, I'm hoping that we'll get a little bit of a survey of information. So if you are watching this and then later on you get interested in psychology later on, or you encounter maybe some bonk pseudoscience or pop psych in the wild, you'll have enough information that you can say, that sucks. And so hopefully that little bit that we build up is going to be able to build into bigger things in your own studies later on. As yeah, this is definitely my sense of humor. So I'm just like I'm just like letting it all hang out. So like I said, expect to stream maybe bi-weekly, maybe weekly, maybe bi-weekly. It's going to depend. I will try to get a alert out there up on my Twitter or my Twitch or my Discord a couple days beforehand, but I don't require attendance. So if you miss one, just check the VOD. It ain't a big deal. And also feel free to reach out to me either during the chat. I'm going to be mostly trying to gear this as sort of a YouTube archivey thing. So my hope is that you're going to be able to reach out to me via the chat. I'm not going to be checking it as actively as if I was playing games or something like that. But yeah, like by all means, chime in. Maybe in later installments, I'll have a chat box up or something like that. But also, if you want to just like reach out to me and DM me, send me a message or a comment on YouTube or something. If you have any questions, by all means, do that. There will be no tests unless you want them. If you really, really want them, maybe I'll make them a sub-goal or something. I can write an exam for you and give you it. Nobody wants that. My exams were actually really hard. My students complained a lot because I hate doing didactic questions like, which is the correct definition? So I would give people a whole scenario and then say, what is this an example of? And most people really struggled with applied questions. It was kind of a problem, actually. And a frequent source of complaints about me at the end of the semester. So anyway, let's get into it. So lesson 1, this is going to be the first chapter. I really want to get into let's go into a broader survey of like, what is psychology? What is scientific thinking? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions that float around about what is psychology as a discipline. People see horoscopes, they see pop psych stuff, they maybe come across some very dubious accounts on Twitter, and they're like, oh, well, aha, that is psychology. And I don't want to gratify that. I want to very quickly from the jump distance what I'm going to be talking about from the kind of bonk pseudoscience that floats around on the internet. I want to talk about psychology as a scientific discipline, its history, and how what I want to talk about and what I do professionally is different from what some people might think of as psychological research. So a little bit of a roadmap, the stuff we're going to talk about in this lecture, in this week, in this session. We're going to talk about what is psychology. We're going to talk about definitions of pseudoscience. What are the key characteristics of scientific thinking? And we're going to talk about a little bit of the history of psychology as an academic discipline. So we're going to go from Wilhelm Wundt to B.F. Skinner to, unfortunately, Freud and Jung. That's some editorializing there. So let's do some fun stuff here to begin with. True or false? If you've watched me before, you probably know the answer to this. But in case you haven't, whomst amongst us believes that people only use 10% of their potential brain power? Yes, this is the iceberg meme. This is definitely false. This is big false. Thank you all. You wouldn't even need me. I don't even need to be here. But that doesn't stop Hollywood and a lot of other popular science, like pop psych and pseudoscience, from keying in on this myth. It's actually surprisingly common for people to believe this, that human beings only use a small percentage of their brain, and actually if we could access the other 90%, we would have psychic powers and be able to play many roles like Scarlett Johansson, many of which we probably shouldn't. And there is a lot of reasons that people might be able to think this. For example, if we look at something like an fMRI image, like you can see in the top there, sometimes people can see these and without the proper background or misinterpret these as saying that the other areas of the brain that are not showing up on that chart are actually inert, or they're not doing anything. And we're going to be talking about neuropotentiation and all the other cool stuff that goes on with the brain and anatomy. So this one is definitely false. Has anyone ever tried this, where if you're angry, you can reduce your aggression by screaming into a pillow? See. This kind of comes into when we get into emotions and emotional regulation, we'll be able to talk about the catharsis effect or the catharsis theories. It's a complicated question, actually, and it's not really true or false. There is some research that would suggest that these temporary displays of aggression are actually good at, in the short term, reducing or preventing another misdirected expression of aggression. However, in some cases, expressing that feeling might cause someone to recognize that they actually do have frustration, that they are angry, and then they might have to process those emotions. So it's a complicated yes or no. It's not really a clear answer. And that's going to be a consistent theme in this course. The answers are not always easy. How about this one? Opposites attract. Oh, I gotta take a sippy of my coffee real quick. No way. Actually, sounds false. Sounds false. For magnets, yeah. For magnets, yes, it's true. Thank you. Thank you, Exciting Clown Posse. It does depend on the context. True for magnets. And in fact, it's even though this is anecdotal wisdom, it seems to be that when it comes to relational theory or how people form relationships, especially romantic relationships, the crux is that opposites attract, but there's a caveat that doesn't make its way into the popular zeitgeist, and that is opposites attract and then repel. So we'll talk about that with relationships and dating and all that, because of course that falls into psychology too. Now this is the one that is in my wheelhouse of social psychology. The more people that are present at an emergency, the more likely it is that someone, anyone, will help. Yeah, some of you already know this one. The answer is no. In fact, this was a very, 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 very famous example of the bystander effect. And then it's like, so way back when, in the 1960s, there was a famous case of Kitty Genovese, who is also preserved in a song lyric by the band AJJ, where she was brutally murdered outside of an apartment building where 37 people heard her screams for help and did nothing. In fact, it wasn't even so much that she was attacked and then immediately died. She was attacked multiple times by the same person before she ultimately died. And this became a national sensation about the declining moral character of, I guess, the urban centers and urban landscapes. And if you've listened to my other bit, you know that there were other things going on in cities during the 1960s as well. So this became a subject of a moral panic, but over time, researchers have keyed into this question and have noticed that this is actually an example that is pretty common to find, the bystander effect, which is that a diffusion of responsibility can occur when multiple people are present at the site of an accident, meaning that it is less likely that any one individual person is going to step up and do anything because everyone's looking around and thinking, well, that person's not doing anything and that person's not doing anything, so why should I don't know what I should be doing. So we're going to talk more about the bystander effect, and we're going to talk about also different ways to circumvent it in case you are ever in an emergency. And too many cooks spoil the broth. Also, we're going to talk about teamwork and everything like that. So we're going to have a lot of fun here. I'm hoping we're going to have a lot of fun. I'm having a lot of fun already. I hope you are too. So what is psychology? It's a complicated question. It is the scientific study of the mind, the brain, and behavior. I want to really key in on that difference between the mind and the brain. The brain, whenever I'm talking about that, is a physical entity. It is a bundle of neurons that exists within your skull, but not mine, because I exist only as a collection of animated Photoshop layers. When we talk about the mind, though, I do have one of those, and it's actually pretty good sometimes. We're talking about the extraction of cognition, the idea of our sort of inner space, the mind palace. So that's sort of our experience of cognition, whereas the brain is the physicality of the body. And when we talk about the behavior, we're going to be talking about the interactions between the mind, the brain, and our environments to produce a specific outcome in our experience, in our behavioral environment. Psychology can span a vast amount of topics, it can span a vast array of techniques, but they are all united under the scientific method. But it turns out that psychology is hard. As you can tell from my second favorite Onion headline, my favorite is still the artists continue to produce music as if Megadeth's Rust in Peace is not the perfect piece of art. But it turns out that this is a very complicated question, and psychology gets knocked a lot as a soft science because it deals with something that is quite complicated, and that is the idea of the mind trying to possibly study itself, which has historically, over the experience and history of social psychology and psychology more generally, been an enormous challenge. Can the mind really know itself? And it turns out that complicating everything is that human behavior is very difficult to predict because the same outcome can be multiply determined. And when I say multiply determined, I mean you can have the same outcome and that can be brought about by any number of an array of different sources. So let's say, for example, someone starts showing symptoms of clinical depression. There are a lot of different reasons that could be happening. They might have recently moved across the country to start a new job. They're feeling uprooted and isolated, and that might be harshing their mood. They might have a family history of depression that's rooted in a neurochemical imbalance. There's any number of things that could be happening, and it's not even so much that there's even really one cause. It's that these causes also are rarely independent and are also interacting with each other. So trying to figure out what's actually undermining one specific element of human behavior is extraordinarily complicated because they can differ from person to person. So if you ever come across someone who says that there is a single answer for any one thing, it's usually a sign not to trust that person, or that you might be dealing with pseudoscience or messy pop psych with someone who really doesn't understand what they're talking about. So that's just a little bit of knowledge I'm going to arm you with there. Be distrustful of singular explanations in psychology. Yeah, like I said, we all have individual differences in thinking, emotion, and personality. I mean, let's look at this. Like this example here. Let's say the behavior is virtual tubing. It's VTubing and streaming. There are any number of reasons that a person might want to do this. Some people do it for income. Some people do it for fun. Some people do it as a creative outlet. And even though the behavior might be the same, that you click live and you go talk to strangers on the internet, turns out there are many different paths that can lead to the same destination. And even further complicating it, because it's not bad enough yet, people influence each other in what we call reciprocal determinism. So right now I am streaming, you are watching me on a channel. If you're watching me live, you're actually able to directly interact with me via the chat. Or if you're watching in terms of archives, you can give me feedback and impact future streams. All the while, I'm actually talking to you and I might be influencing your behavior. So there's a whole chain of events of give and take that's going on. So if someone were to tell me, hey, Ricky, your model is really cute, I might stop the stream for a second and stammer for a bit and be like, that's not true. See? Reciprocal determinism. And what better example of reciprocal determinism is there than the classic Asch experiment? So I'm going to ask you all a very simple question. There's a line on the left here. Of the lines on the right, which one of them is the same length as that first line? I'll give you a second for this one. I see. No, I do see, because actually the answer is, some of you are overthinking this. Actually, Chroma got it right. The answer is C. It's very intuitive, right? If you're just sitting here by yourself and you look at these lines, it makes sense, right? You just look at it and you say, obviously it's C. So Solomon Asch did a famous experiment on conformity where, see, this is part of it. Some of you are expecting to be tricked because there are dynamics in the social interaction that you are thinking, that VTuber has a giant brain hidden under her hat and she's trying to trick me. So in the expectation that you're going to be tricked, you didn't take the obvious answer, even though it was right in front of you. So in Solomon Asch's experiments, he brought participants into the lab and had them sit with a group of people, but they were Confederates, that is to say, they're in on it, they're research assistants. And they asked them this exact question, but they sat the participant at the end of the group, and then they had everyone that's in on the experiment give the obviously wrong answer. So they would ask, which of these lines is the same length? And all of these people that are in on the joke would say, it's B. And they would be assertive, B, definitely B. And then when it gets to the one actual participant, they look around and they're like, I guess it's B? If you were to ask them in isolation, they would probably obviously say the correct answer, but the social pressure of being in a room makes them doubt their own assumptions. It's also known in fighting game terms as the no mix-up mix-up. So they also have done a whole world, and we'll talk about Asch's experiments and conformity later on, but there's a whole ecosystem of literature around this paradigm looking at stuff, manipulating the number of people that agree. So maybe, let's say there were 4 Confederates and 1 participant. What if one of the Confederates also gave a different answer and made dissenting from the group more normal? Does that impact people? What about the role of power or social status? What if you tell somebody like when the teacher is wrong, is that more persuasive than when it's another classmate? If the streamer were to tell you that the answer is B, well, you might be thinking, wow, shit, I mean, maybe there's something wrong with my computer monitor. Maybe something, you would start to doubt your own perception. So there's a good question here. Are we really objective? For example, are our political beliefs, our perceptions of reality really all that accurate? This is what we call naive realism, which is really how we perceive the world. We generally, as people, believe that the way that we see the world is the way that the world is. For example, if I look at a candle, I assume that that candle is a candle. If you look at a VTuber, you assume that that model might actually be the same as, like, maybe you might assume that I have 3 dimensions. Once again, I do not. I exist only in the 2nd dimension. Now, here's where I date myself, and you can probably figure out where my slides are from. Some of you might remember The Dress, which was a global sensation of where some people see this like I do, and they see the dress as blue and black. Some other people see it as white and gold. Those people are wrong. So in the end of the, but this kind of hits at the same point. When I brought this example up in class, my students went nuts because about half of the class saw it as white and gold, half of them saw it as blue and black, and they could not reconcile it because of this whole premise of naive realism. We go through the world believing that our perceptions of it are objective, when in reality, there's a whole lot of mediating processes that go on in how we interact with and perceive the environments that we're in. Oh, some of you do see it as white and gold? Wow. Can't believe you're wrong. Now, here's a fun one. This is where I actually do trick you, or at least I'm going to play with your perception for a bit. I'm going to tell you these center lines are the exact same length. But because of the surrounding context of the arrows that are on the edge of them, you probably, if you're like me, perceive the one on the left as being longer than the one on the right. And that gets even, this is called the Muller-Lyer Illusion, and it gets even more complicated when you take literally the same photo. Like this is just, these layers are inverted, but when you put the differences in perspective and reference in there, our brains process a 2-dimensional image where these objects are exactly the same size as having different dimensions, because we do not actually perceive the world objectively. We don't just see it as the sum total of parts. Our brains have a complex series of operations that we do on everything that we encounter that are going to pull in and contextualize that information in a way that is in many cases unique to us. Isn't that cool? Your brains are lying to you all the time. So what we say is common sense, because we have these ideas that our experiences are normative and objective and shared, it's easy to slip into believing that common sense is common when oftentimes these statements are very contradictory. Birds of a feather flock together, but also opposites attract. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, but also being out of sight means out of mind, which means that if I take a hiatus from streaming, you will grow to like me more. And sometimes our common sense is even wrong. But unfortunately, and to complicate things, sometimes it's right. And sometimes it can actually be correct at better than chance levels. So this is where we get into some problems that we'll talk about with base rate problems and heuristics later on in social psychology, that we sometimes make these assumptions about the world around us that objectively are not true, but they become common sense because they are true often enough to feel like they are correct. And when we also get into, it's another level on why common sense is so complicated, it's also not always so common because of what we sometimes call the curse of knowledge. So it turns out that once you know something and once you have internalized some knowledge or belief, it is very easy to believe that other people have that same knowledge. This is what we mean by the curse of knowledge. Yes, we are going to talk about it. Actually, spoiler alert, the next chapter is going to be all about methods and statistics. So we're definitely going to get into that. So these first 2 chapters are like, let's talk about the overlay of psychology and history and context, and then we're going to talk about the importance of methods and how to do experiments. So, curse of knowledge. Curse of knowledge is to say that once you know something, it becomes hard to imagine that it is not common knowledge or not shared by other people. One of the reasons that I don't get up and do more educational content is because even though I know a lot, and as a doctor, there are some contexts and there are some things that I know maybe more about than the vast majority, maybe even more than a dozen or so other people on the planet. But I just kind of assume that everybody knows those things, and so they aren't going to be interested in hearing about them. And this is why scientific observation becomes so important, because our perceptions of the world are fallible. We tend to believe that things are more common than they actually are, and yet we still believe that our perceptions, biased as they may be, are accurate depictions of reality. And so we developed science. So what does it mean to be scientific? Generally, to be scientific, or to apply a scientific method, is a way of generating knowledge, not the knowledge itself. So science is a process and a system by which we observe the world around us. It is not necessarily the product of that knowledge. Does that make sense? So the chemical formula that you discover as a chemist is not science in itself, but it was achieved via a scientific method, which generally follows by starting with an observation, generating and testing a hypothesis, seeking explanations that fit that data, and then repeating. Emphasis on repeating, because the process of science is one that does not ever really end. There is always the possibility that there might be a confound, there might be a better explanation, or you might have missed something along the way. So reproducibility and repetition are maybe the most important step here. At least in my opinion, that's a little bit of editorializing. So is psychology scientific? That's a hard question. There are times that I think psychology has been more or less scientific. Unfortunately, as we talk about reproducibility, and spoilers ahead, there have been some regrettable moments where maybe the field of psychology was not the greatest at holding itself accountable. So for example, let's talk about Freud. Freud is probably a classic example. Freud mostly talked to wealthy Victorian women and then extrapolated their experiences to all of humanity. That's not a scientific process. Jung, not that much better. And even in recent times, we'll talk about one study in particular, the BEM ESP study, that was published, I want to say, within the last 15 years, and really shook and exposed psychology to itself, is how far people had slipped into not necessarily holding themselves accountable to the scientific method. So what is a theory and what is a hypothesis? There is a difference between a scientific theory and a theory that your friend comes up with. Specifically, a scientific theory is going to be used to explain data and can be used to produce specific hypotheses. You have a broadly defined theory about the connection between variables. So if I know that, let's say, broadly defined theory, I'm trying to think of a way to make this VTuber, but forget, I'm not going to make it VTuber. Broadly defined theory, ice cream sales go up when the weather is hot. You might say that, all right, well, my specific hypothesis then is that people are going to be buying more frozen treats as the Earth gets warmer under global warming. That is a specific hypothesis derived from a broad explanation of the connection between two variables. The hypothesis, like I said, is a specific and, importantly, testable statement that can be true or false derived from that theory. And even though there is a common myth, as Blade Brent brought up, that there is a sort of a pipeline that you test a hypothesis, then that informs the theory, and over time, theories become law, that is not correct, because scientists use terms differently than the media. And in fact, a lot of times, what we consider to be quote-unquote laws or fixtures within the scientific canon end up getting revisited, invalidated, or even rewritten over time. So this idea about the pipeline to hypothesis theory law doesn't really work. In a scientific process, you use a theory to generate a specific prediction, you measure that, and then you revisit the theory. Maybe you need to revise it. If that theory wasn't true under a specific set of circumstances, well, then you need to find a way to revisit it and generally find a way that you can adjust the theory to be more accurate to the world around us. I'm gonna take a sippy real quick. I have forgotten to hydrate for like the past hour of talking. 40 minutes of talking. Oh, that's good hydration. So, and apart from being a process by which we generate knowledge, science is also a safeguard because, unfortunately, psychologists are people too. There's even a person behind me pulling the strings, and as such, we are very fallible to confirmation biases, stuff like belief perseverance, and science as a process protects us from fooling ourselves and slipping into patterns of belief that might necessarily be true but might feel very true. So I want to talk to you all about Clever Hans, my favorite horse. I'm a fan of many horses, but Clever Hans takes the cake. So maybe you've heard this story before, but if you haven't, let me explain it real quick. Clever Hans was a very smart horse, and Clever Hans's owner actually came to the conclusion that Clever Hans was able to do math, the smartest horse of all time. So the owner would count, would give the horse an equation, and the horse would stomp its hoof a number of times in accordance with the answer. So 3 plus 3, the horse would clomp 6 times. Now, this seems incredible, right? This horse could count. This horse understood mathematical equations, number lines, and all that. What does this actually mean? It was a revolution at the time. Well, under scientific scrutiny, it turns out that the real explanation for Clever Hans wasn't necessarily that the horse was able to count, but rather, even without realizing it, Clever Hans's owner was subtly signaling the horse. And so, let's say, for example, the answer is 6, right? He might nod his head 6 times, and Clever Hans picked up on that cue and would clomp when he nodded, meaning that there was the appearance that Clever Hans was able to do math, but it was really just a training response from his owner having conditioned him to that specific behavior. It's kind of a bummer, and this was found out via the scientific method because, well, in trying to control for different variables, the answer then the way to look at this was to say, well, in order to test whether or not it's actually the horse and not the owner doing something, well, a researcher who was very interested in Clever Hans came in and said, well, does the horse still do this behavior when I'm the one that's here and trying to condition them to give this mathematical response? Turns out they were not. But Clever Hans still exists in the scientific canon as an example of the utility of science and how people can fall into rabbit holes of their own beliefs. And personally, I am desperately awaiting the appearance of Clever Hans and Uma Musume Pretty Derby, but that's beside the point. So, what exactly is a metaphysical claim? And how does that differ from a scientific claim? In the Gold's model down here at the bottom, we're talking about religion as an example, but you can also supplant this with pseudoscience or even, just say pseudoscience. That's probably the best one. So a test of a hypothesis must be falsifiable, and we must be able to say definitively that it is wrong. So when we get into things like metaphysical claims like people have souls, or in the case of very popular pseudoscience, maybe stuff like people can activate the last 90% of their brains and activate psychic powers, or that ESP is real, these are not necessarily testable claims. Or in the cases where they are formulated into testable hypotheses, they tend to fail. So it's important when we're talking about psychology as a scientific discipline, we are also talking about psychology as something that exists within the confines of testable data. When you start getting into stuff like people will talk about on Twitter, like aura reading and being an empath and stuff like that, that's beyond the purview of this course and what we're really interested in. And part of being able to test things means that you are also going to be wrong some of the time. And good scientists are able to accept that they might be wrong. Being falsifiable is part of the deal. And scientific knowledge, as I said earlier, is always tentative. We exist within degrees of confidence, and much like when people propose very simple or single-factor solutions, people that are saying that this is like 100% the explanation or want to give you very confident answers might not necessarily be giving you good information. And even generally accepted theories remain theories. We don't wish them into law. We acknowledge that maybe a better explanation might always come along. And science forces us to question our findings and our conclusions. At least we try. So now we're going to get into pseudoscience. And this is going to be let me take a big sippy because this is going to be a big one for me. My least favorite part of this course. It's a very cute duck. I have to put cute stuff in this section of the lecture or else I'm going to get angry. So what is pseudoscience? Pseudoscience is a set of scientific claims that seem scientific but is not. And there are a couple warning signs that you can usually key into, stuff like ad hoc immunizing hypotheses. So what does that mean? An ad hoc immunization is an upfront, basically an excuse that is locked and loaded that if this does not work out, well, then the test was never really going to work anyway. Obviously, that was never going to be the case. So the classic example of this is psychics in a lab, where maybe a researcher puts them in a situation to test whether or not they actually do have psychic powers, and as happens every time, they don't actually have psychic powers. But then when the data comes back that, maybe if they were trying to correctly identify the number on a playing card that has been placed face down on a table, the data comes back and says they're not accurate at more than a chance level. They're just guessing. Well, they might say, and part of this experiment is that you didn't let me have enough time, or I'm away from my home, I'm uncomfortable, I didn't sleep well the night before. There's all kinds of explanations that a person can come up with to explain away why this hypothesis or this test failed. Have you ever, again, dating myself, have you ever seen the movie Mystery Men with Ben Stiller? It's a good one. So I actually haven't watched it in a while. It might not be a good one, actually. But there is one character in Mystery Men. This is pre-Marvel. It's kind of a goofy superhero movie. Kel Mitchell plays a character who is, I guess later on, and late in the movie, it's revealed he's been right. But his whole shtick and a running joke in like 90% of the film is that he swears up and down that his power is that he can turn invisible. But he can only turn invisible if no one is looking at him. So he has an ad hoc immunizing hypothesis. If people look at him and his powers don't work, it's because they're looking at him. I can't be invisible if you're looking at me. That's preposterous. Why would you think that would work? There's other warning signs, including over-reliance on anecdotal evidence, a lack of peer review, or a lack of self-correction. Also, if people aren't able to articulate what they're talking about in plain language, aka psychobabble, run away. Like, when I look at stuff, again, like on social media, the kind of things that really get me hot under the collar, but not in a good way, I usually am also running into psychobabble, where this person is talking about chakras or energies or any kind of things where like they're just throwing words out there that sound very important. My favorite actually is when people start using particular things that sound scientific but misuse them. Like talking about particularly brain anatomy. Like, oh yeah, this medication, if you use this crystal, it activates Wernicke's area of the brain and expunges the gunk around the myelin sheath of the neuron. And it's all bullshit. It's all bullshit. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you're into crystal healing. It's not real. But it's using, decalcifying your pineal gland is a big example of that one. Because the pineal gland is real, calcification is real, they sound like scientific terms, and if you put them together, though, it's nonsense. And this is very prevalent in self-help books and as well as horoscopes. So it might be a little bit tiny on the magic blackboard, so let me read this one to you. Carl Sagan, original host of Cosmos and great inspiration to me in my life, had a great episode in his book, The Demon Haunted World, Science is a Candle in the Dark, where he talks about the existence of horoscopes and people's persistent belief in them. A scientist has placed an ad in a Paris newspaper offering a free horoscope. He receives about 150 replies each, and as requested, detailing a place and time of birth, each respondent is then sent an identical horoscope along with a questionnaire asking how accurate the horoscope had been. 94% of the respondents replied that they were at least recognizable in the horoscope. However, that horoscope had been drawn up for a French serial killer. And if an astrologer can get this far without ever meeting his subjects, think about how well someone sensitive to human nuances and not overly scrupulous might do. When you see TV psychics, a lot of them are practicing something that they call cold reading. And this is rooted in pseudoscience and horoscopes and the belief that, again, going back to naive realism, people tend to believe that their impression of the world is accurate. So when this stranger comes up and is able to make a cold read on you, a lot of people are susceptible to believing that they are actually not necessarily selling snake oil, but they actually do have the powers that they promise to. So why are these things so persistent? Well, turns out our brains are very prone to recognizing patterns in the world around us. I forgot how hard it is to lecture, actually. I'm like, back when I was in practice, 50 minutes was about my limit, and we're coming up to there, but I gotta power through. Our brains are very prone to recognizing patterns. If you've ever played basketball or played NBA Jam, you've heard the term "he's on fire," which means that a person implies from a statistical sense that being successful one time might make you more successful on a later trial. I got one basket, so I'm more likely to make the next shot. Or, this is very prevalent in gambling as well. You win one hand at blackjack, you might believe you're more likely to win the next hand. Which is why, guess what? The house generally always wins, because even if you do win, it makes most people who aren't aware of these kinds of patterns more likely to stay at the table, which means that whatever winnings they could have walked away with, they're not going to. They're going to stay and eventually lose because their brains are more likely to recognize a pattern rather than realizing that them winning was the exception and not the rule. The same thing is true with curing colds. Colds are viruses. The emergencies or orange juice or whatever you're taking is not going to cure the cold, and yet we are very likely to believe that there is a relationship between these things and alleviating cold symptoms, even though it's really just a matter of time. And if you ever have watched supernatural TV shows, I actually used to be a pretty big fan of Art Bell back in the day, you've probably heard about the faces on Mars. Now, when you look at this rock, and even now I'm looking at this rock, I see a human face. And this was, when these photos came back, I want to say back, it was either in the 90s or the early 2000s, this was a huge thing. People took these photos as evidence of life on Mars. But it's really just a trick of the light. Our brains are super attuned to recognizing patterns. And in some cases, with things like faces and all that, we are super attuned, evolutionarily attuned, to recognizing certain facets of our environment and making connections between them. Shit's wild. And as a consequence, people tend to believe what they want to believe, and this is applicable to everybody across disciplines, and whether or not you're a layperson or a scientist or a VTuber. As we talked about with the horoscopes, people tend to internalize general information as true if they feel it's personally relevant, which we call the Barnum effect. Why does it work? Because if we can make connections in general information back to our real life, somehow it feels more accurate or more personally relevant. Going back to the example of psychics and cold readings, if you go to the actual process and have any interest in understanding how psychics actually work or how to become one, a huge part of it is they start very generally. A psychic might tell somebody, you've lost someone recently. And then the person like, oh my God, how did you know? That general statement feels like it's accurate, feels like it's personal. And then the person has imbued that psychic with credibility. They want to believe them. And so whatever that person then sells them from that point on is going to be more likely to land. There's many, many books you can read about how to do cold reading and how psychics work. A lot of them are actually very interesting. Part of this is because of emotional reasoning. Going back to the psychic example, if you've lost a loved one, many people are very prepared to believe that there is a world beyond where their loved one is happy. It's comforting, and it makes them want to believe it more. Sometimes we believe things because other people around us believe them. And sometimes we are inclined to believe that we are also immune to these kinds of failures. It's not going to happen to me. I am actually quite special. Someone could tell you that, now this is a morbid example, but you should get vaccinated against COVID-19 because if you do get vaccinated, even in the case that you are exposed, you're much less likely to have severe symptoms that might result in hospitalization. Someone might hear that and say, yeah, that might be true, but I'm built different. So why should we care? Obviously, the public health example is very relevant, but there are really three major reasons. One, if we aren't accurately evaluating the world around us, we're going to slip into problems. We're going to have opportunity costs where we might actually waste our time and our resources on chasing rabbits. And that comes with a cost. If you spend money on snake oil that a psychic sells you, that money could have been spent elsewhere. If you end up spending even your time on something that has been motivated by pseudoscience, there's a cost to that as well. In some cases, that can result in direct harm. If somebody engages in pseudoscientific cures instead of actually seeing a doctor, they may actually be incurring a direct harm in delaying treatment and maybe even worsening their condition over time. Also, it hurts their ability to think scientifically about the future information that we acquire in the world. So even science is not necessarily perfect because we are all human and we are prone to human error. Even deer can sometimes be prone to human error. So generally, this is where peer review is supposed to come in, but it doesn't always actually work out perfectly. Where is it? Did I take it out? Dang it. This is where I screwed up and now I'm going to leave in. So let's just say, leave it there, that we are, as humans, prone to error. And that is true of scientific inquiry and peer review. Even if we do want to say, well, of course it's in the scientific literature, it's been reviewed, my peers have looked at it. Your peers are also fallible. Your peers are also prone to all these same problems. And there are some notable cases where obviously dubious research gets published for any number of reasons, whether it be social pressure, whether it be people wanting to do favors for their friends, and so on and so forth. Take a sippy. Let's see. So the question is, what's the number on papers that are straight up wrong again? I don't know offhand. I do know it's staggeringly high. The example that I have in these slides and I tend to go for, there was a paper published by Daryl Bem in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, or JPSP. In my field of social psychology, JPSP is the premier journal. It's like science with like the journal Science or Nature within our sphere. And Bem managed to publish a study that was purporting that he found evidence of extrasensory perception among undergraduates at their university. It made it through peer review. It made it into the top journal of our field. It's absolute bullshit. It was actually the moment that really keyed people in social psych to wake up and be like, damn, we need to hold ourselves to better account. All right, sippy complete. So what does it mean to be, what does it mean to think scientifically? It doesn't mean to be closed-minded. It just means to be scrupulous about the information that you do take in. Wait, it is in here. So science is ideally self-correcting. Here's the paper, actually. Okay, found it. I am so smart. This is the real professorial experience where I forget what's in my own slides. So here's the actual paper, like I was saying. So feeling the future. Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognition and Affect by Daryl J. Bem of Cornell University. Did you know that undergraduate students at Cornell University can literally see the future? They cannot. I'm sorry. If you're an undergrad at Cornell University, I am sorry. You do not have extrasensory perception, or as Bem was nice enough to call it in the abstract of this paper, psi. Now, there are some people who actually think that maybe Bem published this paper as a call out, like it's a meta call out of look what I can publish and it'll land in the top journal of our field. But supposedly I've heard through the grapevine that Bem actually is a believer in ESP, so I don't know what to make about that. But the case in point of this is that even though science is ideally self-correcting, and thankfully stuff like this eventually was rooted out and triggered a much bigger discussion in scientific research, particularly social scientific research and psychology, it was still out there for a period of time. And self-correcting does mean that people make mistakes. And if this is one of the papers that got published and in a top journal, there's probably a lot of papers out there that are straight up wrong. And I know it looks like Raina put out a figure, it's like 80 to 90%. I would believe that. Even if they're not malicious, that there's some kind of other confound or there's a statistical error or something. I have come to the conclusion that the bulk of scientific research, unless someone can reproduce it and reproduce it consistently and robustly, I tend to be very skeptical of what I read. So more about scientific thinking. Generally, we want to rule out rival hypotheses, and it's important to entertain alternative explanations for the findings that are being considered. One of the ones, and this is where reproducibility comes in, one piece is just, did I get lucky? If we're using a p-value of 0.05, we'll talk about those next session. But if we're just saying that we're using probabilistic testing to determine whether or not we should accept or reject a hypothesis, you're gonna get some false positives and false negatives some percentage of the time, right? That's how it works. Which is why it's so important to run the study multiple times and make sure that you are able to consistently get the same result. And also to entertain the idea that correlation is not necessarily causation. If you want to plug this in as well, I'm not going to bring this link up at the time, but it's a very funny page that goes into a bunch of different spurious correlations and causations, like how rising temperatures cause more shark attacks, ice cream sales cause more violence, so on and so forth. Turns out that actually, just because there's a relationship between A and B doesn't mean that A is necessarily causing B. This is infuriating to me because scientific researchers, especially even published scientific researchers, break this rule constantly. People always try to make causal claims about correlational evidence, and it drives me crazy. Now, here's a good one. Yeah, that's one of my favorites too. The people drowning at the beach is correlated to the number of Nick Cage movies released per year. Hey, correlation doesn't equal causation unless. So emphasizing again, falsifiability, making sure that the claim can be disproven is a cornerstone of scientific claim. And as I've been harping on this whole time, replicability. Do we actually get the same result when we try to measure this same connection again? Do we get it under different circumstances? Do I get the same result in a group of undergrads on the West Coast as I do on the East Coast, as I do in Europe, as I do in Japan, as I do in China, as I do in Australia? And one of the important things to keep in mind, or an interesting effect in the scientific literature, is the decline effect. The extent or the strength of effects tends to go down as they are measured. That's not necessarily because they are getting weaker, but because if you are basing your assessment on only one instance of an effect occurring, odds are that effect might actually be an outlier in terms of its relative strength. We'll talk about that more with methods and how we measure effect sizes and stuff like that. But just keep in mind that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If I were to tell you that I am a deer, you should demand some extraordinary evidence because most deer do not look like me. So we have a number of tools. You might have heard of Occam's razor. So in general, it's like, again, going back to characteristics of psychobabble and pseudoscience. Taking that big sippy. When it comes to like psychobabble and pseudoscience, remember we talked about how they're all very complicated and they might use very heady terms to explain very simple things. By and large, I'm a big proponent of Occam's razor. The simplest explanation that fits the data well is generally the one that I'm going to publish. And so if you see a study that has a bunch of different confounds, is measuring a whole bunch of different variables and all that, some of which might necessarily seem like they aren't necessarily related to the question at hand, that's an example of something you should be suspect of. All right. I'm going to pivot into, this would have been day 2 if I were to be teaching. So I'm going to wrap up here with a brief history lesson in the field of experimental psychology, and then pivot to a little bit of a QA. So that's at least my plan here. And oh gosh, I forgot how hard lecturing is. It's much harder than just streaming. I got to get my lecture muscles back together. Okay. History of psychology. In the beginning, there was philosophy, and early psychology was not necessarily all that distinct from a philosophy of the mind. So we talk about René Descartes, who actually came up a couple of times in the How to Do Nothing lecture series. Well, you could make an argument he was definitely a philosopher of the mind. He has a lot of abstractions and a lot of theories about what is cognition and what is the brain and what is the mind. But we wouldn't necessarily call Descartes a psychologist. And it wasn't until about 1879 that Wilhelm Wundt founds the first psychology lab in Germany. And we particularly associate Wilhelm Wundt with structuralism, as well as the technique of introspection. We'll talk about that in a second. And over time, psychology has this arc of going from being very unscientific to being more scientific, and then in some cases branching off in directions like psychoanalysis that ended up being even less scientific. So there are 5 major frameworks, major eras, or major approaches that we're going to talk about. And that's going to be structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, cognitivism, and psychoanalysis. And these have all sort of stemmed, and oftentimes in concert and sometimes in opposition from each other, over the course of the last couple of centuries, leading into the present day. So ever since Wilhelm Wundt started the field of experimental psychology back in Germany, there's been a lot of branches that have sometimes grown in parallel and sometimes intersecting directions. So, oh no, it's cut off a little bit. It's fine. Structuralism. All right, there's a picture there of the man, the myth, the legend, Wilhelm Wundt. My academic pedigree, as everyone's academic pedigree as a psychologist, actually goes back to him. And he is a major figure here. It's like in terms of founding or at least playing a role in the foundations of structuralism. Let's see, what is the question here? A question from the audience. Psychology is one of the newer branches. Yes, in terms of science in general, psychology is considered to be one of the more recent branches in terms of scientific inquiry. So we get beat up a lot by people that want, like, mostly BAs with biology degrees who want to tell us that our work sucks or that we're a soft science. And usually my response is to say, hey, yeah, y'all have also had hundreds of years of introspection and inquiry that we haven't had yet. So like, you'll let us cook. All right. When we're talking about structuralism, we're thinking about what are the most basic elements of the psychological experience. So this is a shift from a purely philosophical inquiry to trying to incorporate scientific techniques and scientific introspection into psychological inquiry. The way they tended to do this was exactly as I said, introspection. They would pull people into the lab and they might ask them a question like, what is 10 plus 15? And then as the person solved that equation, Wilhelm Wundt and other structuralists would ask them to explain what that cognitive experience was like. While you are handling this process, your brain is doing math. What is going on? If you're asking someone, I want you to remember a positive memory from your childhood, you might ask them, what is that experience of remembering like to you? There's a problem here, obviously, in that it's skewed towards just really looking at individual people's perceptions. But this is really the first idea that underscores the idea of a scientific, psychological line of inquiry. Then the name structuralism even comes from and is rooted in this idea that, guess what? The experience of cognition is valuable, and it can be systemic, and it can be understood. That our minds are a comprehensible experience that is subject to scientific inquiry. And this then leads into functionalism. Now here's another major figure. Now, William Wundt was a major figure in really founding experimental psychology in the field in Germany. William James takes it another step. And actually, I want to say I'm shooting from the hip here. I might be wrong on my psychological history. I should have looked this up before I said it. I want to say William James founded the first experimental lab in America. But more importantly, he was a contemporary of and also very heavily influenced by Charles Darwin. So in looking at the origin of species, he took the ideas of structuralism and tried to put them through a Darwinian lens. And that is to say, we have this whole mess of thoughts and cognition and memory and process and perception. If we want to apply that in a Darwinian sense, it must serve some adaptive purpose. And so William James takes this idea that the brain is something that can be understood and says the brain is something that can be understood, and also we can understand that as how it contributes to some form of adaptive purpose. We can understand our thoughts and cognitions and behaviors in a Darwinian sense. Now, this leads into, later on, the field of behaviorism. So there's this idea, now we have this belief that our thoughts matter, our minds can be understood, and that there is some purpose in how all of this connects. Well, Ervin Pavlov, you know him for his dogs. Skinner, you know him for his boxes. Watson, you probably don't know him for quite as much. Wanted to specifically understand the laws of learning. Again, building on functionalism, we know that we can learn. We know that we have memory. We know that we have these adaptive responses in the way that we perceive and react to our environment. And so this is where we get things like classical and operant conditioning. We'll talk about those when we get into learning. But this is where behaviorism gets very interesting. And now, if again you remember my old series, we talked a little bit about B.F. Skinner in particular and his work and contributions to Walden 2. Now, Skinner eventually found his way into what we call radical behaviorism, a forking branch off from behaviorism, which takes this idea and really kind of throws out the idea that our cognitions and thoughts really matter. What really matters is what is observable. And this was in time a reaction to criticisms of psychology as a soft science. And so thinkers like Skinner thought, look, we got these thoughts, we got memories, we got feelings, we got cognition, but we cannot easily measure them. So fuck it. They don't matter. The only thing that we care about is observable behavior. And then in a reaction to radical behaviorism, we move into cognitivism. Oh yeah, that's a clever pun. Yeah, he was also involved in radical behaviorism, but before that was in ratical behaviorism because of all those rats in boxes. You know, you can only spend so many times with rooms full of rats and Skinner boxes before it starts to rub off on you a little bit. All right, cognitivism. Major figures here, we've got Piaget on the left, we have Nasir on the right, and they are really forming a reaction to behaviorism. So whereas behaviorists, and especially radical behaviorists, are saying, throw out human thought interpretation, it doesn't fucking matter. Well, Piaget might look at that and say, well, if we go back to the roots of functionalism, we have thoughts and feelings and interpretations for a reason, and they are important, and we should be considering them if we're going to try to consider scientific inquiry. And so we get, with cognitivism, an attempt to operationalize and measure those types of experiences and bring them back into the scientific discourse. Which, in some cases, I'm going to editorialize a lot here, brought us to psychoanalysis, where we get to Freud and Jung. You have Freud on the right, Jung on the left. I'm taking a sippy. So psychoanalysis is almost an overreaction in some cases to behaviorism, in that idea that it's not so much that thoughts and feelings and cognitions matter, it's that actually the hidden internal psychological processes and bringing them to the surface is actually what we should be focusing on. It's not so much that it's actually just about observable behavior, it's about the unobservable thoughts that we should really be caring about. Like the id and the ego and the superego. We're going to talk about these later. But each of these fields have had lasting contributions to the field of psychology. So take, for example, structuralism. This is really where we get the introduction of empirical inquiry into the field of psychology. We have the first traces, even though they were based on introspection, of systemic data collection in psychological inquiry. When we get to functionalism, we get the roots of evolutionary psychology. We get this idea that we can understand psychological processes as having an adaptive purpose. Behaviorism, although there are very founded criticisms of it, uncovered many of the laws of learning and was a genuinely good faith effort to improve the scientific rigor of psychological inquiry. Cognitivism brought back in the idea that our thoughts and interpretations of events are important to understand. And psychoanalysis, I'm one of these people that might actually argue that it was a net negative in the field of psychology, because there is a lot of bullshit that floats around now that is rooted in psychoanalysis, but some of the theories and perceptions and ideas of stuff like subconscious processing have inspired working hypotheses, and a lot of my own work in, well, the wild world of implicit attitudes and implicit social cognition is rooted in psychoanalysis. Part of the reason why I have such a reaction to Freud and Jung is because a lot of what I've done professionally and my major contributions are in some way rooted in their own work. So what are some different types of psychologists and different careers? Well, you got clinical psychologists who tend to work with mental disorders. You have counseling psychologists who tend to work with temporary problems that are not necessarily rooted in medical causes. The big distinction here is that oftentimes clinical psychologists, or particularly psychiatrists who are even more clinical and are actually more medical doctors and deal with medication, are dealing with longer-term problems, whereas counselors tend to be dealing more with short-term temporary issues. School psychologists might be embedded in a school environment, working with young people to develop interventions at different stages of their developmental track. That's in concert with developmental psychologists who are going to be looking at change in time and change over life course. People like me who are experimental psychologists that tend to conduct research, and many, many more. As we get into the next chapter talking about methods, we're going to be talking about this distinction a little bit more, but it's important to keep in mind that there is a difference between basic and applied research in psychology. I tend to be an applied psychologist, and these are in concert with each other. Basic work might seem very lame sometimes, where you're looking at sort of very root causes and root processes, that might seem like they aren't necessarily always applicable or necessarily relevant to the world that we live in, but they help inform applied research where we take these basic and very root tenets of psychology and apply them forward, looking at more direct or applied circumstances. Oh, cut off again a little bit, but I'll fix this going forward for the next chapter. If you've ever seen a yellow fire engine, you have psychology to thank. Because it turns out that some people don't pay attention to red fire engines in their environment, because guess what? If people get desensitized to them, and the initial perception of a striking red fire engine that was there to catch people's attention, people get desensitized and start to lose track of them over time. And so some municipalities have actually started working in yellow fire engines because they stand out to people. For better or worse, we're going to talk about the SATs, ACTs, and GREs as well. But you do have psychologists to thank for the advent of standardized testing. Or, in my mind, to blame, because I think standardized testing sucks. But also things like more accurate criminal trials, because our applied research has gone well in identifying pitfalls of how people work in terms of persuasion and memory, and that has been able to work to turn out more accurate criminal trial proceedings and even exonerate some people from crimes that they did not commit. We'll talk about failures of memory and persuasion later on as well. So psychology in everyday life. Coming to the end, I really want to think about, when I think about psychology in everyday life, I think about being able to critically examine the world around me, and I think about being able to critically examine the claims that people make about the world around me and also my own mind. I think applying psychology in everyday life, and I hope both from this lecture and also going forward, will help people insist on and also evaluate the evidence that they get when they come across different claims. And I hope it will help people also be aware of their own biases. It's like whether it's that awareness of itself is necessarily sufficient to dissuade people from falling into the rabbit holes of pseudoscience and non-scientific thinking. It might not be the case, but I think it's important to just be aware of our own biases. I'm a social psychologist. I am very aware that I am of how fallible I am, and I try to take that as an onus to be especially scrutinizing when it comes to my own perceptions of the world. All right. Well, that's what I got for this whole chapter here. So I hope you enjoyed this. This has been a fun thing for me to put together. It's been a lot of work, and I hope it was maybe a little bit helpful even. So next time I do this, I'm aiming for next weekend, but depending on what's going on with the holiday, I might not be around. So I am going to be getting into the wild world of research methods and statistics. So keep on the lookout for that one. I'm going to probably post on my Twitter, also in Discord and on my socials. The links down there are a little bit below on the stream. So just keep an ear out. I'm going to try to get this up and try to hang out and maybe talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart, which is the importance of rigorous methods in experimental psychology. So on that end, I'm going to end the stream here. I hope you all had a good time. I'm going to stick around for a bit and take some questions. And I am going to transition over to a different scene.